Today we're looking at some heretical forbidden lore with some leaks of demons rules from the new codex. Soul grinders are looking dangerous, there's some rather brutal looking psychic powers going around, plus rules for heralds, chariots and more. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking about some more demon leaks for Warhammer 40k. The Daemons Codex has been long awaited throughout the edition, and hopefully it should allow them to be competing more on the same level with the armies at the moment. Today we're going to be rounding up the latest leaks that I haven't talked about on the channel yet, and have a think about what they might mean for the Codex. As with before, the source of these leaks are a trio of leakers on Discord and YouTube, so full credit to these goes to Mrs. Wallace, Corkin and Trout. They're going to be posting further leaks each week apparently, and have access to an early draft playtest copy of the Codex, meaning that broadly these changes should be accurate, though there's always the possibility for some small revisions by the time the book actually comes out. As per usual, I'll leave a link to Wallace's YouTube channel below. He's been covering some of the stuff that's talked about, the rest comes from the Chaos Daemons Discord server. Starting out though, we've got a rather complete profile for the Soul Grinder, which up until now in 9th edition has been rather underwhelming as demon units go, despite getting a points drop. It's not awful in defense, but just really doesn't have the damage output to make itself useful, only hitting on force, and currently they cost 160 points. This guy seems to have received a general all-round glow-up. It still moves 8 inches, but now it hits on 3s at least, has both strength and toughness 8, so really quite meaty there, a big 16 wounds, 5 attacks, leadership 8, and a demon save of 4+ against range and 5+ in melee. Compared with the old stat line, that's hitting on 3s rather than 4s, which is a very big deal. Jumping up to toughness 8, particularly with that 4+ invul save at range, will make it very annoying to shift, as will going up to 16 wounds as well. Generally all round better, though I wouldn't be too surprised if it does go up a few points as well, maybe going back to more like 170 or 80. First up, its combat has got a fair bit better. At base, you get the 5 attacks as before from the Iron Claw, strength 16, AP 3 and damage D6. That's not really changed all that much, besides the fact that you're hitting on 3s now, so you're going to get more of those attacks actually converting. It's quite nice for anything without an invul that relies on its toughness, such as say if you're fighting knights. Then the only option that the Soul Grinder has on its datasheet currently is to trade either a Warp Sword or a Warp Claw in its other hand, and previously this gave you a different attack profile that you could hit with, but now it just gives you a number of extra attacks at the one profile or the other. If you take the sword, then you just get 2 extra attacks at strength 8, AP 3 and damage D3 plus 3, and if you take the claw then you get 4 extra attacks at only AP minus 2 and damage 2. Apparently you can only make those extra attacks with those weapons, you can't make everything with them, so sometimes the warp sword might be the superior choice, but you still only get to make the 2 extra attacks, and I think between the sword and claw things are fairly balanced to be honest. Unless there's external buffs, I feel like people are usually going to prefer the sword. Big damage attacks to chew through elites and vehicles seem to be the order of the day at the moment, though I think the claw is still kind of fine, as it'll do you better against infantry. Overall it adds up to a significant melee boost, extra attacks and hitting on 3s means it's far more threatening. Then for shooting, the major upgrade that it's got here besides hitting on 3s is that Harvester Cannon. It's now 48 inches, heavy 6, strength 6, AP minus 2 and damage 2, so it's kind of like one half of an Avenger Gatling Cannon for Imperial or Chaos Knights. This one's a significant tune-up. Previously it was only 3 essentially auto-cannon shots, so now this thing is actually fairly credible as a threat for chewing through elite infantry. It still gets the Phlegm Bombardment attack as well. D6 shots at strength 8, AP minus 2 and damage 3, unchanged bar hitting on 3s, and still going to be a good generalist all-round profile. Finally, I believe that you have to pick a god dedication for the Soul Grinder. It wasn't mentioned whether or not this costs extra points or anything like that, but I strongly suspect not. If you're Zinch, then you also get a 4+ demon save in melee as well, not bad for a fairly threatening combat critter. Khorne gets +1 attack with the Iron Claw, Nurgle gets +1 toughness for a big toughness 9, which is kind of cool, and Slaanesh gets a +2 movement. In reality, I think it's more going to depend on what your core strategy is and which gods that you're using for which one of these you'll pick, but just on the face of it, I feel like Khorne's probably the weakest of those, and maybe Nurgle might be the most interesting, as it really ruins things like melter weapons shooting at it. In any case, depending on the points cost, this thing's looking pretty interesting again. Just with the raw defense against shooting that it gets, plus some fairly generalist damage profiles at combat and melee, it seems like it's hard to go too far wrong with. Next up, just in passing, one of the leakers did seem to confirm the rules for Heralds now. Previously, Heralds of Khorne and Slaanesh and things gave you +1 strength to their nearby god-specific units, and you could use it out of Codex as well, which allowed for some other interesting shenanigans with Chaos Space Marines demon units. It sounds like the standard Herald buff has changed a bit, now it's reroll 1s to wound within 6 inches for core units, and I think typically that will be a little bit less overwhelming compared with before. I guess for any units with fairly decent strength it might be a bit better, as it actually guarantees that you do get a bit more damage output, but I wouldn't be too surprised if they keep it locked within the Demon Codex for these buffs. Throughout 9th edition there has been a bit of a trend on cutting down on unintended synergies between multiple codexes. I do wonder whether Greater Demons might have reroll 1s to hit, and these might have reroll 1s to wound, so both could work in synergy. In any case, they seem pretty interesting between that and their psychic power. Next up, we've got one specific herald that won't be having a psychic power though, and this is the Blood Throne of Khorne. According to Mr. Corkin on Discord, this one's now been rebranded to a Renmaster on Blood Throne. Basically one of the 2 builds that you can get for the Khorne chariots between this and the Skull Cannon, which we'll get onto. As a herald, he does give that reroll 1s to wound buff for the core Khorne units, and in lieu of a psychic power he gets a different buff as well, a command phase buff for 1 bloodletter unit to get 6s to hit auto wound. Not too bad for mid-strength melee weapons that apparently have 2 damage now. Stat line wise, this guy's got decently more tanky. Its movement has gone from a rather depressingly slow 6 to 8. It hits on 2s in combat, has strength 6 and toughness 7, 5 attacks, 9 wounds, and a 4+ demon save both at range and in melee. Overall a decently faster and tankier profile, plus it's got what looks like an actual decent buff if you are using bloodletters, and maybe blood crushers too if they also happen to have the bloodletter keyword. Finally, in combat itself it also got a lot more dangerous. The Ren Master himself gets 5 attacks at strength 6, AP 3 and damage 3, seems very good for taking out enemy characters that one, and the attendant bloodletters get strength 6, AP 3 and damage 2 attacks, both of them basically essentially getting +1 damage from before, and should be great into elite infantry, killing something like 3 or 4 Space Marines per round of fighting. Overall it's just all around better, faster, more dangerous, harder to kill, and better buffs. I guess I wouldn't be too surprised if this went up slightly, going from 115 points to something a bit more. It'll be really annoying to take out as well, as it's a character with wounds less than 10, and you should be able to look out Sir it. Next up, and perhaps one of the most interesting leaks out of the bunch, are some psychic powers, these ones posted by Mr. Trout. Of course, Khorne despises all of these, but we've got a few previews for all the rest of the gods. First up, Tzeentch's Bolt of Change looks genuinely very threatening, warp charge 7 and 12 inches, and you get to roll 9d6 at the enemy unit, each one of a 5+ deals 1 mortal wound, plus 1 extra mortal wound for each enemy model slain. It seems like a flatly better version of one of the Thousand Suns powers, that one. A very strong witchfire against just about everything, even more so against hordes, where if you roll well you could be doing a whole ton of damage. I guess Psychic is the main thing for Tzeentch, so you would hope that their witchfires would be strong. This one seems almost auto-include good if you are running Tzeentch to have at least somewhere in the army. The other really powerful witchfire is Infernal Gateway, warp charge 8 and 12 inches, and it's changed a little bit in how it works, doing d3 mortal wounds to the closest enemy unit, plus d3 mortal wounds to other enemy units within 3 inches of the targeted one. Previously it was splash damage off the model itself and hit friendlies too. It was still really powerful, but this seems perhaps even more so, and a bit less likely to bounce back in your face and hit more enemy units. Supposedly if you manage to cast on a 12+, then it does 3 mortal wounds to everyone who it hits. With Lords of Change and Kairos Fate Weaver zooming around, I'm sure they'll have plenty of decent +1 to cast as well to give you more chance of doing that. My guess is that that would usually be one to try and put on something like a Lord of Change that's going to be able to cast it reliably, and depending on how your opponent's army is set up, that could really be a whole ton of mortal wounds if it does affect loads of units. Otherwise, just a couple of hints for the other ones. Treason of Tzeentch apparently turns off auras instead of controlling characters like it does now, and Gaze of Fate has been changed from a single reroll to manipulating the Warp Storm table somehow, though they didn't go into any real detail. For Slaanesh, both of these leaked powers look very good indeed. Symphony of Pain is a debuff that targets an enemy unit within 18 inches, it's warp charge 7, and it makes them -1 to hit and to wound in melee. That's a pretty brutal debuff to be honest. If the opponent's got a prized melee unit, then that's fairly likely to cut their damage output in half. Seems like a very powerful trick to have in the arsenal. The other one shown off is Hysterical Frenzy, also warp charge 7 and 18-inch range. This one previously was a fights again in the psychic phase type rule, which was kind of handy if your opponent happened to leave units locked up with your Keepers of Secrets or something. But now it's just a general melee buff, +1 attack and exploding 6s to hit, so you should be landing a lot more attacks. For Demonettes, I believe that would equate to something like a 60% damage buff, so pretty solid. Finally, for Nurgle, there's a couple of interesting things. Nurgle's Rot is now a very short-range psychic power at Warp Charge 7, but it hits everyone within 6-inch range, and you roll 2d6 versus the enemy unit's toughness. If you beat their toughness, then they get d3 mortal wounds, and if you double their toughness, then they take d6 instead. I guess perhaps the biggest issue is that Nurgle Psychers don't tend to be particularly fast, so you might not have all that great positioning to be able to put this alongside loads of enemy units. Maybe it could be okay on a Great Unclean one though, perhaps, if they are durable enough just to be wading into the midst of the enemy units. I guess you might get a fair few in range if you've got a really big base there. Otherwise, Miasma of Pestilence is apparently a big Warp Charge 8 cast now, and an 18-inch range debuff. One enemy unit loses objective secured, they can't perform actions, and any current actions already started fail. Out of those, I guess the action thing might be situationally useful, but really the objective secured is the big thing in my opinion. If you've got some Plague Bearers on the objective and you remove the opponent's obsec, then it basically means that the objective is yours. I'm kind of surprised though if this does wind up replacing the standard Miasma of Pestilence. The Death Guards still have their -1 to hit, and I wasn't really expecting it to be any different to that, to be honest. Overall though, looks like some really fun stuff. The Tzeentch Witchfires look very powerful indeed, both the Slaanesh powers look excellent melee buffs and debuffs, and the Nurgle ones look interesting if maybe a little bit on the situational side. Apparently they would be getting a 5+ Feel No Pain type psychic power I think as well. I feel like that one might be more interesting than either of these. Next up, on the Discord server, they shared a list of Warp Locus units. Warp Locus was a nice little demon delivery rule that we talked about previously in one of these leak roundups. Basically, most demon units can deep strike for free now. Warp Locus allows them to get easy charges when they come in. You set up your demon unit wholly within 6 inches of one of these Warp Locus keyword units, and if they do so, then you can set up anywhere that's greater than 6 inches from enemy units rather than the usual greater than 9 inch. It means if the enemy units venture too close to these Locus units, then you might be getting a very easy charge out of reserve. 6 inches is going to be succeeding around about 72% of the time, and it's almost guaranteed if you can spare a command point reroll. That did kind of beg the question though, exactly what units will be getting the Warp Locus keyword, and to be honest it doesn't look like an enormous amount of them really. We already knew that 3 of them had it from the Chaos Space Marine Codex, but otherwise it largely seems to be the special character Greater Demons, a couple of bits of terrain, the Infernal Enrapturous and Bellicor. For Chaos Space Marines, having the Master of Possession and Lord of Skulls on there is both interesting. The Master of Possession is easy to be screened and is one that you'd usually want to bring anyway, and the Lord of Skulls is likely to be throwing itself up the board into the midst of combat, and to have it rustle up a unit of Bloodletters or something seems like quite a nice idea. For Tzeentch, the only unit with the Locus keyword is Kairos Fateweaver, though apparently they have some other way to shenanigans warp Locus onto other units, though they didn't say exactly what in this preview. For Slaanesh, it's Shalaxi Hellbane and the Infernal Enrapturous. That's the relatively recent Slaanesh Herald model with the harp. Seems like perhaps one of the easiest ways to get the keyword in the army, as presumably that one won't cost all that much points. For Khorne, besides that Lord of Skulls, it's Scarbrand. He is the one who's looking like he's doing some mad melee damage, and also apparently the Skull Altar will have the keyword as well, which implies that it is going to be in the Daemons Codex. I think they had some rules on that in one of the previous supplements, maybe the Vigilus one perhaps. And to be honest, I wasn't too sure whether or not they'd bother including the rules in the Codex, but it seems that if you want a bit of Khorne terrain, then that's still going to be an option. For Nurgle, it's Rotigus and the Feculent Narmor. Having it on a Great Unclean one seems helpful, as they should be able to move towards the centre of the army and not die, hopefully. And finally, Bellicor himself has all the god keywords. He's got good movement as well, so it could be a good way to swoop in and deliver something very scary for a near guaranteed charge before following up with one of his own. Overall, I think it's fairly interesting stuff. Maybe Khorne's just a little bit on the limited side, and I think that they're one of the ones that would really like this Warp Locus rule. I guess Bellicor delivering Bloodletters could be a thing though. I guess we'll have to wait and see how much sense that makes. Finally, last but not least, we have the profile for the Skull Cannon. Pretty relevant within the Demon Codex, as it's one of the few true demon ranged units, alongside things like the Soul Grinder and a couple of the Tzeentch things like Flamers. The stat line's kind of similar to the Blood Throne changes. It moves 8 inches now rather than 6, still hits on 3s, strength 6 and toughness 7, 2 attacks, 9 wounds, and saves on 4s both at range and in melee. A little bit tougher, plus its shooting has got a little bit better as well, getting D3 plus 3 shots rather than D6, and an extra pip of AP on the cannon, though it does still remain damaged too. It still looks like it's going to be a fairly solid all-rounder, perhaps particularly suited to killing standard Space Marines and vehicles that don't have a -1 damage thing. And it also packs a little bit more threat in melee now that those Hellblades are getting damaged too. 6 damage 2 attacks in total, 2 of them at AP -1 and 4 of them at AP -3. I guess it wouldn't exactly be a corn unit if it didn't still cut people up fairly well in melee. So overall, a rather interesting haul of new rules for the Dark Gods there. Let me know what you think of the changes down in the comments below. Do you think that the Soul Grinder buffs are going to be good enough? And what do you make of those psychic powers? As I mentioned, please feel free to check out Wallace's channel down in the links in the video description. His latest one was on the Soul Grinder. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly do my best to keep up with these demon leaks and any other news and rumours that come out of Games Workshop. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the stuff on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.